There are disasters that arrive without warning. An earthquake strikes in seconds. A hurricane appears on weather maps days before landfall. A flood announces itself as rivers begin to rise. But some disasters begin with a single decision, one that seems so ordinary that no one notices history changing. In the quiet hills of eastern Pennsylvania, there was once a small coal town named Centralia. A place where church bells marked Sunday mornings, children walked familiar streets to school, and generations of miners disappeared underground before dawn, returning home covered in black coal dust by sunset. For the people who lived there, the earth beneath their feet was more than soil. It was their livelihood, their history, their future. Yet beneath those peaceful streets lay something almost forgotten. Miles of abandoned coal tunnels. A vast underground maze left behind after decades of mining. Most residents rarely thought about it. To them, the mines belonged to another generation. But hidden within those abandoned passages remained exposed coal seams, silent, untouched, and capable of burning for decades if ever ignited. No one imagined they would, at least not publicly. Because 1 year before the fire that would erase Centralia from the map, one man was asked to look beneath the town. Not to predict a disaster, simply to answer a practical question. Where should the borough expand its landfill? It sounded like routine municipal planning. A survey, a report, a council meeting, a vote. Nothing about those events suggested they would become part of one of America's longest-running environmental disasters. Yet decades later, historians would return to that ordinary assignment again and again. Not because of what everyone knew, but because of what one surveyor quietly recorded while walking through abandoned mine tunnels beneath the town. His official report would be archived. His private notebook would not. And inside that notebook were observations that would remain largely unseen for decades. Observations that raised a disturbing possibility. Was Centralia simply the victim of an unfortunate accident? Or had someone recognized the danger before the fire ever began? That question changes everything. Because history is often written through official documents. But sometimes the truth survives in private pages never intended for public view. Before smoke rose from the ground, before homes were abandoned, before roads cracked open, there was only a surveyor carrying measuring instruments into darkness. He wasn't searching for a mystery. He was measuring distances, recording elevations, mapping forgotten tunnels. It was work he had performed countless times throughout Pennsylvania's coal country. Professional, methodical, unremarkable. Yet this assignment would become unlike any other. By 1961, Centralia had already lived through decades of coal mining. The industry had shaped every corner of the town. Entire neighborhoods existed because miners once needed homes within walking distance of the shafts. Schools, churches, grocery stores, and family businesses had all grown around an economy powered by coal. But as mining declined, something else remained. An underground world. Hundreds of interconnected tunnels stretched beneath hills, streets, and homes. Some had collapsed naturally. Others remained surprisingly intact. Many were only partially documented. Municipal officials understood that abandoned mines complicated future construction projects. Whenever roads, utilities, or public facilities were planned, underground conditions mattered. That is why the Borough Council commissioned a professional survey before expanding the town's landfill. On the surface, the decision reflected responsible planning. Rather than guessing what lay underground, they wanted evidence. Measurements, maps, engineering recommendations. The surveyor accepted the assignment with the calm professionalism expected of someone whose career had been built on precision. His tools were simple by modern standards: survey chains, compasses, lanterns, field notebooks. Every measurement depended upon patience rather than technology. Each tunnel had to be entered carefully, every intersection documented, every elevation checked repeatedly. Underground surveying demanded absolute concentration. A single mistake could affect every measurement that followed. For weeks he descended into abandoned passages beneath Centralia. Some tunnels remained dry. Others echoed with dripping groundwater. Timbers installed decades earlier still supported portions of the roofs. Elsewhere, collapse had sealed entire sections forever. Coal seams appeared and disappeared along tunnel walls. Most represented nothing unusual. Coal had always surrounded miners underground, but occasionally, something caught his attention. The distance between exposed coal and the surface above seemed unexpectedly small. Not everywhere, only in certain locations, especially beneath land being considered for future municipal use. Instead of assuming an error, he measured again, then again. The numbers remained consistent. His notebook gradually filled with careful sketches, elevations, and annotations. Every page reflected the habits of someone who trusted measurements more than assumptions. Those private notes were written only for himself. They contained observations too detailed for formal summaries. Small reminders, cross-checks, questions, professional thoughts recorded before memory could fade. At first glance, nothing appeared dramatic. There were no emotional declarations, no predictions of catastrophe, only technical observations. Yet decades later, researchers would notice that these handwritten entries carried a different tone from the report eventually submitted to local officials. Not contradictory, but more specific, more direct, more personal. As the survey progressed, one particular area continued demanding extra attention. There, the abandoned workings passed unusually close to the surface. Nearby, exposed coal seams approached ground level more closely than expected. The surveyor verified his findings repeatedly. Experienced professionals rarely trusted a single reading. If something seemed unusual, it deserved confirmation. His instruments continued producing the same answer. The ground above those tunnels appeared far more vulnerable than surrounding areas. By themselves, those measurements meant little. Coal beneath the surface is not automatically dangerous. Abandoned mines exist beneath countless communities. Risk depends upon what happens above them: construction, excavation, ignition sources, human activity. Those factors transform geology into potential hazard. The surveyor understood this. That understanding quietly shaped his private observations. Later readers would discover not alarm, but concern. Measured concern. Professional concern. The kind expressed by someone trained to describe evidence rather than emotion. Eventually, field work ended. The notebooks closed. Maps were finalized. Cross-sections prepared. The official report took shape. Its language reflected engineering conventions of the era. Careful, reserved, objective. It described underground conditions, documented coal seam locations, included recommendations, suggested caution. Nothing sensational, nothing dramatic. Exactly the sort of report municipal councils received across Pennsylvania every year. Yet somewhere between the notebook and the finished document, something subtle changed. The raw observations remained, but the urgency became less visible. Whether this reflected professional writing standards, editing conventions, or simple differences between private notes and public reports remains debated today. No surviving evidence conclusively answers that question. What survives instead is comparison. And comparison raises difficult questions. Because historians now possess both versions, the official report and the private field notebook. Together they reveal not two different realities, but two different ways of describing the same one. At the time, no one could know those differences would someday matter. The Borough Council prepared for its public meeting. Residents expected discussions about budgets, land use, waste disposal. Routine local government. No one arrived believing they were witnessing the beginning of a disaster that future generations would still study. Yet beneath every word spoken that evening lay a map few people fully understood. A map drawn by one surveyor who had already walked through the darkness beneath Centralia. Would eventually outlive the town itself. By the autumn of 1961, the survey was complete. The measurements had been checked, the maps carefully drafted, the field notebooks closed and placed alongside the official report that would soon reach the borough council. For the surveyor, the assignment was finished. For Centralia, it had only just begun. When the council gathered to discuss the proposed landfill expansion, the atmosphere was ordinary. There were no television cameras, no state investigators, and certainly no expectation that this routine municipal meeting would one day become part of American environmental history. The town simply had a problem that needed solving. Its existing dump was nearing capacity. Garbage had to go somewhere. Like hundreds of small towns across the country, Centralia faced a practical question with limited resources and even fewer affordable options. Several possible locations had already been considered. Some were too expensive. Others required additional infrastructure. Some presented logistical challenges that exceeded the borough's modest budget. The proposed site appeared to solve most of those problems. It was nearby. It was accessible. And according to the official engineering documents, it could be developed. From the council's perspective, the decision may have seemed entirely reasonable. But every practical decision carries assumptions. And assumptions become dangerous when they overlook what cannot be seen. Beneath the proposed landfill lay an underground world almost completely invisible from the surface. Old mine entries, collapsed chambers, interconnected passageways, coal seams exposed decades earlier during mining operations. Most residents never thought about them. Children played above them. Families built homes above them. Churches stood above them. Daily life continued without any visible reminder that an industrial labyrinth still existed beneath the town. The surveyor had seen that hidden landscape firsthand. He had crawled through sections where timber supports groaned under decades of pressure. He had followed abandoned haulage tunnels that disappeared into darkness. He had measured elevations where exposed coal reached surprisingly close to the surface. Those observations now existed as numbers on paper. Whether those numbers conveyed the full seriousness of what they represented depended entirely upon how they were interpreted. And interpretation is rarely straightforward. Professional reports during the early 1960s were written differently than they often are today. Engineers and surveyors generally avoided emotional language. Their role was to present facts, not conclusions about political decisions. Modern readers sometimes expect warnings written in unmistakable terms. Danger, immediate risk, do not proceed. But technical documents from that era often communicated concern through measured language rather than dramatic statements. That distinction has become one of the most debated aspects of the Centralia story. Did the report communicate enough? Did the council understand what the measurements actually implied? Or were practical pressures already pushing the decision toward a conclusion before the meeting even began? The surviving records cannot answer every question. They reveal discussion. They reveal consideration. They reveal a vote. What they do not fully capture is every conversation that occurred before or after the official meeting. Like so many moments in history, much of what shaped the final decision exists only between the lines. Meeting minutes summarize outcomes. They rarely preserve tone. They rarely record hesitation. And they almost never capture private uncertainty. Some accounts suggest the surveyor was present during at least part of the discussion. If so, he may have answered questions that never appeared in the written record. Perhaps he clarified technical details. Perhaps he explained how abandoned tunnels behaved beneath the surface. Perhaps he emphasized caution. Or perhaps he simply responded to what he was asked, leaving broader conclusions to elected officials. History cannot reconstruct conversations that were never fully recorded. It can only compare what survives. Eventually the council reached its decision. The landfill project would move forward. On paper, it looked like progress. The borough would gain a larger waste disposal site. A practical municipal problem would be solved. Life would continue. No headlines announced the vote. No protests followed. No emergency declarations were issued. For the people of Centralia, it was another ordinary chapter in the administration of a small Pennsylvania town. Earth-moving equipment reshaped portions of the selected area. Access routes were improved. Routine municipal operations slowly transformed the site into the community's expanded landfill. Nothing immediately appeared wrong. Weeks became months. The landfill functioned exactly as intended. Garbage accumulated. Maintenance continued. The surveyor accepted new assignments elsewhere across Pennsylvania's coal region. Like most professionals, he trusted that his work would simply become another archived project in a long career. His notebooks remained private. His report entered official files. The town moved forward. But beneath the surface, nothing had changed. The abandoned tunnels remained exactly where they had always been. The exposed coal seams remained exactly as they had been measured. The earth beneath Centralia waited in complete silence. Sometimes history unfolds, not because something changes underground, but because human activity above it finally reaches the wrong place. Months passed without incident. If anyone questioned the landfill decision, daily life offered reassurance. There were no collapsing streets, no unusual smoke, no mysterious odors drifting through neighborhoods. Children continued riding bicycles along familiar roads. Church congregations filled every Sunday. Coal miners who still worked nearby returned home each evening, believing tomorrow would look much the same as today. The absence of immediate consequences created confidence, and confidence can be deceptive. Many disasters begin with long periods during which nothing appears unusual at all. That quiet interval convinces people the danger never existed, until one ordinary day, when the first unmistakable sign finally appears. For Centralia, that day arrived in May 1962. As Memorial Day approached, preparations began to clean the municipal landfill. Burning accumulated trash had become a familiar practice in many communities during that era. To local officials, it likely seemed routine, manageable, temporary. No one gathering near the site could have imagined that the flames rising from the surface might reach something waiting below. The fire itself appeared ordinary. Smoke drifted upward. Firefighters responded. Hoses soaked burning debris. On the surface, the emergency seemed under control. But underground, an entirely different story may already have begun. And what no one yet realized was that one surveyor had measured the hidden pathways capable of carrying that fire far beyond anything visible above ground. The true investigation was only beginning. The firefighters believed they had done their job. The flames at the landfill had been knocked down. The smoke had begun to thin. To everyone standing on the surface, it appeared to be another routine municipal fire. Messy, inconvenient, but ultimately under control. Had anyone left the scene that afternoon, believing they had just witnessed the beginning of a disaster that would last well beyond their own lifetime, they would almost certainly have been dismissed as alarmists. Nothing visible suggested catastrophe, and that is precisely what made Centralia so dangerous. Because the greatest threat wasn't the fire everyone could see, it was the one no one could. For days after the landfill fire, small wisps of smoke continued rising from scattered sections of the site. At first, this wasn't considered extraordinary. Buried trash often smoldered long after open flames disappeared. Fire crews had seen it before. Municipal workers expected it. Yet something about this fire felt different. It refused to die. Each time officials believed it had been extinguished, new smoke appeared somewhere nearby. The ground itself seemed unwilling to cool. Weeks passed. The landfill continued producing heat. What initially seemed like stubborn surface combustion slowly transformed into something far more difficult to explain. Then investigators began asking a question that changed everything. What if the fire wasn't burning in the landfill anymore? What if it had already escaped? That possibility redirected attention underground. Engineers and mining officials examined the site with increasing concern. Test borings were drilled into the earth. Temperature readings were taken beneath the surface. Gas samples were collected. Every new measurement pointed toward the same disturbing conclusion. The fire was no longer above ground. It was moving through abandoned coal workings beneath Centralia. Suddenly, the survey completed only a year earlier became far more significant. The underground maps that once existed merely to guide landfill planning had become critical evidence in understanding the fire's possible path. Officials unfolded diagrams showing forgotten mine tunnels stretching beneath neighborhoods. Passageways, once carved by miners decades earlier, had unintentionally become corridors through which heat and flame could travel. The underground network connected far more than anyone standing on the surface could appreciate. Every abandoned tunnel represented another possible route. Every exposed coal seam represented additional fuel. There was plenty of both. When news reached the surveyor, the connection was immediate. The location investigators described was painfully familiar. He had walked those tunnels, measured those elevations, recorded those coal seam exposures. The names written on official maps matched places preserved in his own field notebook. According to later correspondence, he privately revisited his original records. Page after page confirmed what memory already suspected. The measurements had not been wrong. The location now burning underground was the same area that had drawn his repeated attention during the survey. No engineer welcomes the moment when a warning becomes reality. Validation often arrives at an unbearable price. Still, the surveyor remained largely silent in public. His profession had taught him caution. Facts mattered, evidence mattered, speculation did not. While newspapers focused on the growing underground fire, he quietly compared current developments against observations recorded months before the first spark. Meanwhile, Centralia continued functioning. Schools remained open. Businesses served customers. Families celebrated birthdays, weddings, graduations, and holidays. Life above ground resisted the idea that disaster had already begun. Because unlike earthquakes or explosions, underground mine fires do not announce themselves dramatically. They spread patiently, sometimes only a few feet each day, sometimes faster, always hidden, always consuming fuel beyond human sight. That slow progression created a dangerous illusion. If nothing dramatic happened today, perhaps nothing serious was happening at all. Officials explored every available solution. Some proposed flooding portions of the mine. Others recommended excavation. Engineers debated sealing tunnels to deprive the fire of oxygen. Each proposal faced the same obstacle: cost. Suppressing an underground coal fire was vastly more complicated than extinguishing flames on the surface. Every day the fire remained active. It spread farther through abandoned workings. Every week increased both technical difficulty and financial burden. Yet funding remained limited. Political attention shifted elsewhere, and the fire continued moving quietly beneath the town. This period would later become one of the most debated chapters in Centralia's history. Could more aggressive intervention during these early months have prevented everything that followed? Experts continue discussing that question. Some argue the opportunity still existed. Others believe the fire had already advanced beyond practical control. There is no universal agreement, only evidence. And evidence shows that valuable time was lost while officials searched for a solution equal to the scale of the problem. The surveyor watched these developments with growing unease. His field notebook had documented underground conditions before ignition. Now state investigators were documenting the same underground system after ignition. The comparison was impossible to ignore. His measurements no longer represented hypothetical risk. They had become part of an unfolding reality. Years later, in a deeply personal letter written to his son, he would reveal something he had never fully expressed in public. He believed the council had been warned, not necessarily with dramatic language, not through emotional predictions, but through professional evidence that identified the danger inherent in that location. The letter was calm, measured, almost restrained. There were no accusations shouted across the page. Instead, there was the quiet disappointment of a man who believed his work had described a risk that, in hindsight, deserved greater weight. He reflected on the difference between his official report and the notes he had written only for himself. Professional language, he suggested, may have softened the urgency. His private notebook, however, preserved everything exactly as he had observed it underground. That distinction would become one of the most fascinating elements of the entire Centralia story. Because history often remembers official documents, private notebooks rarely survive. Private letters even less so. Had his son discarded those papers after his father's death, the world might never have known this more personal perspective. Instead, they survived, carefully preserved, quietly waiting in family hands for decades. Long after the town itself began disappearing, long after homes were demolished, long after roads cracked from underground heat, those pages remained untouched, almost as though history itself had chosen to save one final witness. By the end of the 1960s, the fire was no longer simply an engineering problem. It had become a slow-moving environmental catastrophe. Smoke escaped through unexpected places. Hot gases migrated through abandoned workings. Scientists realized the underground coal seam could continue burning for generations if left unchecked. The timeline had changed completely. Officials were no longer asking how to extinguish a landfill fire. They were asking how to stop an underground geological process that had already spread across an expanding maze of abandoned mines. The answers grew fewer, the costs grew larger, and with every passing year, Centralia moved one step closer to becoming a town that history would remember, not for the people who lived there, but for the fire that refused to die. Yet the greatest revelation still lay ahead. Because more than 20 years later, when most of Centralia had already begun disappearing, one forgotten letter and one forgotten notebook would force historians to reconsider the question that had haunted the town from the very beginning. Was this disaster truly unavoidable? Or had its first chapter been written before the first flame ever appeared?